In the summer of 421, before the birth of Christ, a woman named Uma stood among the smoldering ruins of what had once been her home, watching as Spartan soldiers moved through the survivors like wolves among sheep. She was 26 years old. 3 days earlier, her husband, Clemus, had died on the city walls of Mantinea. A hoplite warrior who had fought to his last breath as the Spartan assault finally broke through. For 72 hours, she had hidden in the cellar of her house with her 3 children, 2 daughters, aged 7 and 5, and a son barely 3 years old. Above them, the sounds of battle had raged, metal on metal, screams that seemed to go on forever. And then, finally, that terrible silence that could only mean one thing. The city had fallen. Now she stood in daylight again, blinking against the sun, and watched as Spartan officers separated the survivors into groups with a cold efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The men who had surrendered were being marched away in chains. The elderly were being gathered in one area. Very young children in another, and women like her, women of childbearing age, were being assembled into their own group. Examined by Spartan commanders who walked among them with a detached interest of merchants assessing livestock at market, Uma pulled her children closer, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the crowd of frightened women around her. Perhaps if she remained quiet enough, invisible enough, they would overlook her. Perhaps she and her children could somehow slip away in the chaos. But then a Spartan officer was standing before her, his armor still stained with what might have been her husband's blood for all she knew. He asked if the children clinging to her were hers. When she answered, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded and made a mark on the wax tablet he carried. Then he moved on without explanation, without even looking at her face, as if she were nothing more than an item on an inventory list. That evening, everything changed. Uma and approximately 200 other women from Mantinea were separated from their children. The screams that followed would echo through those ruins for days in the memory of anyone who heard them. Women were torn from their families by Spartan guards who showed no more emotion than if they were separating cattle from calves. Eumelia's 3-year-old son cried out for her, his small voice breaking with terror as he tried to run after her. An elderly woman held him back, designated to care for the children left behind. Eumelia looked back over her shoulder as the guards pushed her forward, trying desperately to memorize her children's faces, having no idea if she would ever see them again. Something broke inside her in that moment, something she would later realize could never be repaired. The march took 3 days. The women were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them walking. At night, they slept on the ground under guard, exposed to the elements, moving steadily southeast toward Sparta. Many of these women had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. None of them knew exactly what awaited them at their destination. But they had heard stories. Whispered tales that circulated among the Greek city-states about what happened to captured women. Stories that made death seem preferable to survival. Stories that suggested there were fates worse than being killed in battle. Worse than watching your city burn. Worse even than being separated from your children. As they walked, Eumelia tried to imagine what horrors could be worse than what she had already endured. She could not yet conceive of what the Spartans had planned. Could not yet understand that her entire existence from this point forward would be designed to serve a system that had destroyed everything she loved. That she would become a tool in a program of conquest that understood something most ancient peoples had not fully grasped. That destroying an enemy meant not just killing their men, but systematically targeting their women, erasing their culture, absorbing their bloodlines, and creating living reminders that resistance to Sparta was worse than futile. It was catastrophic not just for those who died, but for those who survived. What happened to Eumelia and the others over the months and years that followed would exemplify everything that made Sparta unique among the Greek city-states. Not their famous military prowess, not their legendary discipline, but their systematic approach to conquest that went far beyond the battlefield. But to understand what these women faced, you need to understand Sparta itself, how this society organized every aspect of life around warfare, and why the treatment of defeated enemies' wives became a crucial tool in maintaining Spartan power. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I am about to describe is documented in ancient sources. Plutarch, Xenophon, Herodotus, Thucydides, historians who wrote about Spartan practices based on their own observations or accounts from people who had witnessed these events firsthand. If you want to understand how conquest has targeted women throughout history, how systematic practices of forced reproduction and identity erasure have functioned as weapons of war, then subscribe to this channel right now because what comes next will change how you understand ancient warfare forever. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from because this story needs to be heard. Sparta was not like other Greek city-states, and that difference would seal the fate of women like Eumelia in ways more horrifying than simple death or slavery. While Athens developed democracy and philosophy, while other Greek cities built monuments and pursued trade and created cultural achievements that would echo through millennia, Sparta dedicated itself entirely to one purpose: war. Every single aspect of Spartan society was organized around creating the most effective warriors possible and maintaining military dominance not just over neighboring Greek states but over the massive population of enslaved people called helots who worked Spartan lands. These helots outnumbered Spartan citizens perhaps 10 to 1, creating a constant underlying fear of rebellion that influenced how Sparta treated both helots and defeated enemies. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised by the state in the brutal training system called the agoge. They learned to fight, to endure pain, to obey without question, to value the state above their own lives. Individual identity was suppressed in favor of collective identity as Spartans. Weakness was not tolerated. Infants judged too weak or deformed were reportedly left to die, exposed on the mountainside. Spartan society understood something vital about conquest. Killing the men of a defeated city removed only one generation of warriors, but women could bear the next. If these women retained their cultural identity, they could raise future enemies. So Sparta devised harsh methods to prevent this, controlling women's reproduction and erasing their identity to ensure their children served Sparta. When a city fell, survivors were sorted with ruthless precision. Male warriors were executed, and male civilians of fighting age were often enslaved. But women of childbearing age were treated differently. They were gathered and assessed by Spartan commanders who evaluated their age, health, and status. Based on this, they were divided into groups destined for specific fates. The wives and daughters of the defeated elite were seen as symbols of total domination. They were not used for labor but as vessels to produce children of mixed blood who would grow up with Spartan identity. These women were assigned as wives or concubines to Spartan citizens, especially older men without heirs. These unions were state policy, designed to serve the Spartan state. Forced marriages humiliated the enemy and showed that even their noble women had become property. They also ensured that future generations would belong to Sparta, not to the defeated culture. Ancient accounts describe how these forced marriages were conducted as public rituals. The captive woman, dressed as a bride, was brought before the Spartan community to marry her assigned husband. The ceremony mimicked a normal wedding but symbolized conquest. Everyone understood she was not a willing bride. Her husband might have killed her first husband days earlier. Afterward, she was taken to her new home to fulfill duties as a Spartan wife, raising children who would one day fight for Sparta. For women like Eumelia, this fate was worse than death. It forced them to raise Spartan children while mourning their destroyed people. They lived between captivity and marriage, performing normality while enduring unending grief. Some never adapted, living lives consumed by depression, while others chose death over submission, leaping from cliffs or ending their lives before they could be claimed by Spartan husbands. These deaths were sometimes portrayed in Greek literature as examples of feminine virtue, women choosing death to preserve loyalty to their deceased husbands and original cities. But the fact that such choices were necessary reveals the true horror of the system Sparta had created. The systematic nature of these practices is crucial to understand. This was not random violence or individual soldiers acting on impulse. This was state policy implemented according to plans made by Spartan authorities designed to serve strategic objectives. The targeting of women for reproductive purposes was as carefully planned as military campaigns. What happened to the women of Mantinea, what happened to Eumelia and her companions on that forced march towards Sparta, It was part of a conquest strategy that understood women were not merely collateral damage in war, but targets in their own right, tools to be used in the complete destruction of enemy societies. Their bodies, their children, their identities, all became weapons in Sparta's arsenal, turned against the very cultures these women had been born into. This was conquest at its most complete victory, at its most terrible, and it reminds us that throughout history, the horrors of war have often been most brutal.